Hello everyone, this is Lycanhood Reads and my name is Michaela. I'm coming at you today with a October/spooky season wrap-up video. So like most of my reading this year, my spooky season reads got a little bit away from me. I started early. I started reading my spooky books in like September, and then I didn't finish the last one until about a week ago in early November. So the spooky season sort of spans September to November for me, but I did decide to go ahead and wrap it up and give you guys a quick recap of what I got to read during this spooky fall season. So it looks like this year I counted 10 books onto my spooky season reading. I had more than that planned. There were some books from last spooky season that I wanted to carry over and get read this year, but alas, the best laid plans went awry. So I ended up reading some books I didn't expect, and then there were others that I had planned to read that I didn't get around to. Long story short, I read 10 books. These are the ones that I got around to. First up was a new release from this year. I read Youngblood, which is a YA sapphic vampire boarding school. It's a little bit of a childhood friends to lovers or childhood friends to enemies to lovers storyline. These two girls that used to know each other and be really good friends when they were younger but haven't spoken to each other and had a bit of a falling out. They end up being roommates in the same vampire boarding school. And of course there is sexual chemistry and there's miscommunication and hijinks and drama. But ultimately, you know, it turned out to be a pretty fun ride. I have to say I had pretty high expectations for this book. I am a huge fan of vampire stories, especially back when I was in high school and the vampire craze of like Twilight, the Vampire Diaries, all those sort of things was going on. I was very involved in that. And I haven't read vampires in a while because they haven't been as prominent in the market since those sort of faded into the background, but I feel like they're getting a little bit of a resurgence. People aren't quite as put off by the Twilight stigma, and we're getting some really interesting stories out of it. This was definitely one of them. I would say that the vampire elements to this particular book were a little bit lax. They were definitely vampires, but they weren't. They were a very tame version of vampires. There's not a lot of violence or bloodletting. There is some bloodletting, but not a lot of violence and bloodletting. It mostly is just sort of a teen, romantic comedy at its core, I would think. And I have to say that it wasn't everything that I wanted it to be, but I did enjoy it and I didn't regret reading it. If you're looking for any sort of like teen sapphic situation, this has a lot of the good tropes. Childhood friends to lovers, they're at a boarding school, and it's just kind of got all that good stuff that you might be looking for in a romance, plus some vampire stuff. Next, I read Not Good for Maidens. Now, this one definitely was a great one to read for the spooky season. It really did a lot for me after following up that Youngbloods, which was a little bit of a disappointment. This one, in comparison, just hit all the right marks for me. It was exactly what I expected it to be in a very satisfying way. So, Not Good for Maidens is a sort of fairy tale retelling, sapphic. It has two main characters, one of which is Ace and the other of which is Bi. So you've got some good sapphic vibes there. You've got a little bit of monster romance thrown in there because there is a goblin girl that we're falling for. In general, this book just brought sort of like the creepy goblin market vibes. It's got a lot of fairy tale-esque sort of language to it and a very fairy tale-esque atmosphere. And overall, I just felt like this book totally delivered on what was promised, and I ended up really enjoying it. This is when I really felt like my spooky season had kicked off. This is a YA book though. It does have some adult themes. There's a lot of body horror, a lot of kind of disturbing images, I guess you could say. A sort of minimum amount of sexual content, but I would say if this were a movie, it would be rated PG-13 rather than PG. Next, I read a little novella called The Seep. I have to admit that I didn't really know what to expect when I went into this novella. I knew that it was sort of speculative, surrealist type fiction, which I don't read a lot of, but it was so short I figured why not give it a chance. It takes place on a futuristic version of Earth in which at some point in our recent history, an alien being of some kind And this alien entity has sort of merged with humanity as a whole. It's sort of entered all of our consciousnesses and finds a way to like change society and sort of change up the way that humans live their lives. So there aren't really countries anymore. There aren't those sort of political divisions. It's just everyone's out here living in an almost utopian sort of way where you don't have to work. All of your basic needs are pretty much taken care of, and life just becomes a lot more about being creative, being artistic, being self-expressive, and it's about forming community and community bonds. So in a lot of ways, the Seep has helped humanity and has helped us kind of get over our like petty squabbles and whatnot, and really brought us together. But in another way, I feel like it also has this negative effect on humanity. We're making us very vain. And it kind of it's almost like a drug. It has a sort of psychedelic effect on people where it's like the entire human population is high all the time, which, you know. And the novel explores all of this, the novella explores all of this, the good sides of it, the bad sides of it. It has a lot of queer representation. The main character is a lesbian trans woman, I believe. And she just has a lot of mixed feelings about this new world and this new society that the Seep has managed to create for humanity. And she's really struggling with her own identity and her own place in this new society that she feels like isn't as great as everyone else around her seems to think it is. Ultimately, I still am not really sure that super surreal kind of fiction or surreal sort of science fiction or horror is for me, but I did manage to enjoy this one. Like I said, it was super short. I thought that it managed to get its point across, but there were a couple of sequences, like really psychedelic kind of trippy sequences that I began to I could feel myself drifting off and I would lose the thread of what was happening, and I would just kind of wait for those parts to be over so that we could get back to something that I would consider coherent. So I would say if you don't like that sort of trippy, confusing, surrealist writing, maybe skip this one. But it is definitely a cool look at a first contact narrative, and also this idea of an alien consciousness that isn't trying to conquer Earth necessarily. They're trying to make Earth better, but they don't always know what's best for human beings, because how could they? Next is one of my favorite reads of the spooky season, Silver Under Nightfall. This was a fantastic vampire fantasy novel. I've been looking forward to it all year, and it did not disappoint. Just check out this cover. Love it. So, my understanding is this is very Castlevania-esque, and I definitely can't argue with that, given that I had not finished watching Castlevania before I read this book, and right after reading it, I ended up binging pretty much all of it. Because, yeah, it's got strong Castlevania vibes. It's sort of a classic sort of fantasy world, it's got lords and knights and ladies and things like that, but also vampires. Vampires have their own society, their own nobility within this world. They're almost like a foreign country as opposed to the human nations, and so you have to interact with them on a political and on a diplomatic level in a way that I feel like we don't see from vampire stories very much, and I found that very interesting. The main character of the story is possibly non-binary. I'm not really sure. I've seen that kind of thrown around on the internet a little bit, and maybe it's something that I missed in the actual book being pointed out, and if so, that sucks for me. I gotta reread it. But you got something going on with the MC there. He definitely uses masculine pronouns, but some people were obviously picking up on some sort of, neutral or non-binary vibe from him, and that's totally cool by me. But anyway, he is a vampire hunter who has sort of been disgraced by his family and by his lineage. He's not really looked upon very well by other vampire hunters, despite the fact that he is very good at his job and tends to just kind of show them up, I guess. Maybe that's part of why he's so good at it, is that he has to do it alone, whereas most of them work in groups. But anyway, Vampire Hunter teams up for various political reasons with a vampire lord and lady who are a couple and who are very obviously hot for him. And so they pretty much spend this entire fantastical adventure trying to convince him to be a part of their throuple. And he keeps fighting it for reasons that are not quite clear to me. But he does, until eventually he doesn't. I hope that's not too much of a spoiler. There's polyamory in this book. that's going to happen. It's just about waiting for it to happen. And I have to say that I pretty much enjoyed the whole thing. I thought the world was pretty interesting. I love the characters, but more importantly, I love the banter between the characters and the sort of dynamic that they have. It's very exciting to see. It's very queer, very interesting. And I would be happy to read more from this world. I hope that we get to revisit this world, because even though this book does have a pretty satisfying conclusion, I just found myself wanting more. And I think that it's just such a fun dynamic and such fun characters to work with. It's like, why not keep it going? Give me more. Next was a highly anticipated release from Tamsin Muir, and of course I'm talking about the third book in the Locked Tomb trilogy, Nona the Ninth. I immediately read this as soon as it came out. I was lucky enough to get the audiobook on Scribd. And even though I've said repeatedly that the Locked Tomb is not the best series to read on audiobook for the very first time, that's how I chose to read Nona, because I'm broke. However, I don't think it being an audiobook really hurt my experience in reading Nona the Ninth. Of course, I enjoyed it. There were definitely parts where I was confused, or like I felt like I had missed something and I had to go back and re-listen. Because if you're not paying enough attention, this series, I stand by the fact that this series requires a certain amount of your attention, and the best way to read it is probably in physical copy or on ebook. Ebook especially, so you can mark up and make notes and stuff as much as you want. But Nona the Ninth was good. You know, it was another Locked Tomb entry. I have to say that it was probably my least favorite of the three, but it's still Tamsin Muir, it's still the Locked Tomb, it's still Harrow and Gideon, and just this really wacky, crazy world that Tamsin Muir has gotten people so obsessed with. I'm really looking forward to Alecto the Ninth. I'm looking forward to hopefully being able to spend more time with Gideon and with Harrow than we have gotten in these past two books, because I missed them. That's why I'm here. I missed them. But Nona the Ninth was good. It didn't disappoint. Not particularly creepy, not particularly spooky, but I think it's fitting for spooky season nonetheless, because there was a dog, a skeleton dog, and a dog with 6 legs? I can't remember how many legs. It's spooky, okay? Next was a bit of a surprise entry. It's called Gutter Mage, and I ended up reading this one kind of by accident. I just sort of liked the cover, and it was on Scribd, and I wasn't sure what I was going to read next, so I put it on one day. And I ended up really liking it, and it kind of ended up fitting my theme as well. The magic for this book is very sigil-based, and it involves a lot of sort of ritualistic sort of stuff, and they also fight demons. So that's the spookiest part about it, is that this book involves a lot of fighting demons and also like possession, exorcism, that sort of stuff. So even though I went into it thinking it was a little more sort of classical fantasy and like had a more classical magic system, it's really a very demon huntery kind of fantasy and a very demon huntery sort of world. So this one wasn't anything extraordinary, but I did enjoy it for what it was. I believe it's a standalone. I haven't seen anything about a sequel coming out, but I enjoyed it. It's a quick little read. The main character is bisexual and fun and crude and violent. So if you're into that sort of thing, like I'm into that sort of thing, definitely give this one a try. Next would be Summer Sun. So this is one of the books that I actually had wanted to read last October, and it didn't get to it, so of course it carried over this year, and I finally got to read it. And I'm sorry that I waited so long, because I really enjoyed it. I was kind of on the fence about it. I had read some reviews that said it was kind of disappointing, but I mean, for me, it really delivered on a lot of what it promised. You've got a queer Southern Gothic tale about fast cars and cigarettes and murder, and you know, it's high octane, it's good. So it's a sort of, I hesitate to call it dark academia, but they're college students in this grad program. This guy had been planning his entire life with his best friend. They had grown up together, they'd been pretty much inseparable all the way through undergrad. When his friend graduates early and enters into another grad program across the country from him, and he's forced to stay behind, and then that same friend commits suicide. So trigger warning for lots of suicidal stuff. After the death of his friend, he transfers to that same grad program and starts to investigate his friend's suicide and just trying to figure out what led up to these chain of events, like who he was hanging out with, who he was living with. who he was talking to, what he was studying, all this sort of stuff, just starts to investigate his death and discovers a lot of things about their relationship that he didn't realize before, and also makes some pretty interesting connections with the new friends that his best friend had made while living here. So, yeah, I mean, is the plot complicated? No. Is the ultimate antagonist of the story like some brilliant villain? No, not really, but it's a nice ride. I really enjoyed this sort of exploration of toxic masculinity, like male-male friendships, but also this sort of idea of this particularly southern masculinity and this southern way that men feel the need to interact with each other and feel that their relationships have to be limited in this way that is just unfortunate. But this book definitely brought all the vibes. You got some Fast and Furious vibes there, and I'm talking about the first film, Paul Walker, Vin Diesel. You've also got some spooky ghosts, demon, haunting stuff going on. You've got some dark academia stuff, and you've got some gay stuff. So there's a lot to love in this book, I think, and I definitely recommend it for spooky season because it brings all the vibes, especially if you're living in the American South. Moving right along, next I read We Have to Remove This Post. So it follows, the main character is this girl that goes to work for a company that screens internet content for offensive or dangerous materials and has those sort of videos and clips deleted. So she spends most of her day just watching awful, disturbing, violent, offensive things and deciding whether or not they're offensive enough to be deleted off of certain websites, I guess, social media websites and whatnot. And the whole point of the book is to examine how looking at those sort of images and consuming that sort of content on a daily basis in such vast amounts, what kind of effect that has on the mental health of the people who are screening these videos. And the answer is, of course, that it has a negative effect on their mental health. So this book was sort of interesting. Like I said, it was very short, and I saw a lot of people complaining about the ending and that it sort of ends very abruptly. I liked the ending because it's just like the main character has this sort of oh shit moment where she realizes that maybe she's been behaving in a way, maybe she has been affected by this line of work in a way that she hadn't even considered before. And then the book ends. And that's, interesting. That's a way to end it, for sure. Could it have been longer? Yeah. But I'm kind of glad that it wasn't. The main character is a lesbian. And then, towards the end of October, rounding on Halloween, I read Just Like Home by Sarah Gailey. Now, I've read a nice chunk of Sarah Gailey's work at this point, having read American Hippo, and also Upright Women Wanted. And I have to say that I really enjoy Sarah Gailey's concepts, but I do not always enjoy her execution. I feel like she has some trouble sticking the landing sometimes, but at least with Just Like Home, I felt like the book was well-rounded, and I felt like she managed to actually knock it out of the park this time in a way that she hadn't in her previous work, or in the other works that I've read from her at least. This is the story of a young woman returning to her childhood home to take care of her ailing mother after they've had a long separation due to her father being a convicted serial killer. Yeah. So I kind of read this on the back of this whole Jeffrey Dahmer craze, which I have to say I'm not too excited about. I have a lot of mixed feelings about fictional and sort of documentary content about serial killers. I'm not a huge true crime person. And so I went into this one a little hesitantly, but Sarah Gailey really handled it in a way that I enjoyed. And it also has some supernatural elements that I feel like kind of buffered and kept it from feeling like a true crime situation. Anyway, this young woman, she returns to her childhood home to take care of her very grumpy and very dying mother. And she becomes sort of haunted, remembering all of these things about her childhood and about her father and about things that she saw or things that she knew that maybe she didn't realize that she knew, or that she has been unable to accept that she knew about during the long years since she's been home. And that all begins to sort of haunt her, and she has difficulty distinguishing between what's real and what's not real, what she did know and what she didn't. And I just think it's a really cool examination of, like, having that sort of childhood trauma, having guilt about a thing that you couldn't control, about loving someone who is considered to be a bad person but was never a bad person to you, and vice versa, loving the monster within ourselves. I think that the book had a lot to say, and it managed to say it in a way that Sarah Gailey struggles to in a lot of her writing. So I'm just glad that I read it. I thought it was really good, and it's perfect for spooky season. This cover is off the chain. That's all I got to say about it. And last, rounding out my 10 books for the spooky season, is House of Hunger. This is another new 2022 vampire release, and it's sapphic. I have to say that I was a little disappointed by this one as well as Youngblood. It wasn't exactly what I thought it was going to be, and I had very high hopes for it. And even though it's not bad, and I don't regret reading it, I think it could have been so much better. It turned out to just be the most basic way you could have told this story. It takes place in a fantasy world, and the nobility in this fantasy world, they sustain themselves on the blood of young, beautiful women to help combat their illnesses, their various illnesses. Though it's unclear to me if you actually have to have an illness to do this, or if it's just a thing that nobles do, whether they actually need to or not. But they call these girls blood maids. They can be, they kind of enter these noble houses as indentured servants, but they're treated very well in some ways. You know, they don't cook and clean and do servant things. They get to live a very luxurious, kind of spoiled lifestyle. They just have to bleed for it. So this poor girl runs away from her, dingy southern town, and gets accepted into this northern house, the House of Hunger, with its mysterious and charming, but also ailing lady lord, Elizabeth. And she gets adopted into this brood of blood maids, this sort of harem, if you will. And there's a lot of hierarchy sort of stuff going on there, alpha female stuff, the favorite sort of stuff. This book actually reminds me a lot of The Favorite, the movie with Olivia Colman, came out a couple years ago. It's like that. It's The Favorite, but with vampires. This is a great way to describe this book. And of course, it all goes awry. I don't want to spoil anything, but I will just say that I felt like this book and its premise was sort of wasted potential, because there were a lot of cool directions to go in with it, but they just went in the most obvious direction. My biggest complaint is probably about the villain of this book, and the love interest as well. I would say that the love interest is just, there's a lot of talk about about how much the blood maids love Elizabeth, and how in love they are with her, and how obsessed they are with her, and all of this stuff, and how she demands like loyalty, and they have to be loyal, and how they're gonna do anything for her, to keep her pleased. But at the same time, I don't feel like we even get to spend that much time with Elizabeth before the main character feels that way. And I'm just like, where's this love coming from? Where's this devotion coming from? Because I'm not getting it. This character is just she's copy and pasted sort of character, and I didn't find her interesting or worthy of being like this huge looming figure in the novel. The actual character just wasn't living up to her own hype. Anyway, that rounds it out for my 10 spooky books of this year. Thank you so much for joining me. I can't wait for next spooky season to see, because there's a whole list of stuff that I didn't get to this year or the year before, and so I'm just never going to run out. And I find that with each new horror book or movie that I engage with, I just am more fascinated by the horror genre, and I get a better understanding of it, and I get a lot more respectful of the genre as a whole. Because it has a lot of facets to it, and it's extremely fascinating what some horror creators are doing out there. So happy reading, and have a great day. Bye.